So my name is Jessica Nelson. It's my honor to introduce my colleagues here tonight. We're very thankful to Benchmark for hosting us. It's really fun to see this project come to fruition and hold the physical books after all the work that we have put in through the years. So to start off, my name is Jessica Nelson, like I said. I joined the Joseph Smith Papers in 2018 and contributed to volumes 12 and then 14. I did a bachelor's degree at BYU in American Studies and then a master's degree at Utah State. And my current work includes annotating some discourses given by Eliza R. Snow. So that's me. And now I'll introduce Adam Petty over here. Adam Petty is a historian with the Joseph Smith Papers. He served as a volume editor on Documents Volume 14 and the forthcoming 15th volume, here coming in June. He earned his bachelor's in history from Brigham Young University and master's and PhD in history from the University of Alabama. Spencer W. McBride earned his PhD in history at Louisiana State University and is an associate managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. He's the author of 4 books on the history of religion and American political culture, co-editor of 3 volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers, and the producer, writer, and host of the project's 5 podcast miniseries, which I have to say are excellent. And finally, Alex Smith. He has served as co-editor on 6 volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers and is currently leading the project to publish William Clayton's Nauvoo journals. He is also working on a personal monograph exploring the motivations behind Joseph Smith's assassination. All right, so here we go. Like the other volumes in the document series, Volume 14 includes a wide variety of documents that can be subdivided into different genres. One of my favorite aspects of working on this volume was reading and delving into the correspondence that Joseph Smith received during this time period. In my time here tonight, I'm going to highlight a few of these letters that provide insight into the dynamic life that Joseph lived. These letters speak to his role as a community leader, a property owner, a church leader, engaged citizen, prophet, and aspiring political figure. The first document that I want to introduce you to is a letter written from Reuben Hedlock dated 10 to 21 January 1844. Hedlock was serving as the presiding elder of the British mission at the time he penned this letter, and it constitutes a sort of mission report. Hedlock had been a missionary in the British Isles before, and church leaders exhibited a lot of faith and personal trust in Hedlock by sending him back over there. And I think that's why he took the time to write such a detailed recap in his first letter to church leaders as the presiding elder of the mission. This letter is written on 6 bifolia, which each have 4 sides, and the total number of pages for this document, including the source note, introduction, and annotations, is 32 pages long. This is quite a long document to have in a volume, and ultimately required a lot of teamwork to research and annotate the text of the whole letter. One of the fascinating developments to read about in this letter is the tragic drowning of a woman named Sarah Cartwright while she was still in the water after her baptism. Hedlock recounts some of the details in the subsequent criminal trial of Jonathan Pugmire, the elder who baptized her, and Thomas Cartwright, her husband, who tried to save her as the power of the current swept her away. Hedlock recounts how this awful episode created negative publicity for the church as people became suspicious of Latter-day Saints after this and a similar accidental drowning of a Latter-day Saint priest who was performing a different baptism. Local newspapers provide more details about the case that took place. And ultimately, Pugmire and Cartwright were acquitted for want of witnesses on the prosecution side. Hedlock also details the places that he visited on church business and where conferences were held. He provided statistical information about baptisms and priesthood ordinances that had taken place in various places that he lived, using tables that he sketched into the letter. One of the issues Hedlock faced was trying to meet the demand for information from the saints in Great Britain about how to emigrate to the United States and join their counterparts in Nauvoo. Hedlock wrote Joseph Smith and church leaders asking for guidance on how to raise and properly spend church funds in the British Isles. Towards the end of the letter, he listed the names of some of the 200 British saints who would be leaving soon on a ship named the Fanny. One of them, a man named William Kay, hand-delivered this letter when he and the other British saints arrived in Nauvoo that April. And Joseph Smith personally greeted those when they came. Brigham Young and Willard Richards, to whom the letter had also been addressed, wrote a response back to Hedlock in May. It was fascinating to dig a little deeper into the stories of the individuals and families that Hedlock named in the letter. Church leaders had specifically requested that several of these folks come to the United States on the first ship available in an earlier directive to Hedlock. This paints a picture of the kind of networks and friendships that church members created across the Atlantic Ocean in a land far removed from the Western American frontier and shows the impact of Joseph Smith's life on people that he had never met. Several authors wrote to Joseph Smith in February 1844, and 2 of those letters led to the creation of the Council of 50, but more on that later. Around the same time, in mid-February, a man named George Wilson wrote a letter to Joseph in a asking for forgiveness rather than permission tone regarding some trees that he had cut down on Joseph's property. Wilson was a cooper in Nauvoo and had previously paid Joseph for the privilege of cutting down 2 trees on his property. In this letter, we learn that he returned to cut down 3 more trees without having permission to do so. Wilson offered to pay Joseph for the lumber and hoped to stay in Joseph's good graces even though he had acted without talking to Joseph first. With no postal markings, this letter was likely hand-delivered, but we don't know much more about the incident and what followed after that. 2 letters, also dated the 15th of February, were written to J.S. by, and I guess we slip into calling Joseph Smith J.S., and that's what's printed in the book, so that may come across as we speak. So these 2 letters were written by a committee of church leaders near the Black River Falls in Wisconsin Territory. These men had been charged with overseeing the church's lumber operations to source the construction site of the Nauvoo Temple and the Nauvoo House. When the committee realized they would soon attain their goal of lumber needed for these projects, they started to think about what their next task may be. They had also interacted with members of the Menominee and Chippewa nations and wanted to further proselytize among Native Americans in the North American West and Southwest. They decided to write church leaders in Nauvoo and proposed sending an expedition party to the Republic of Texas, then an independent nation, to find a potential new gathering place for the saints, which they anticipated would include many converted indigenous people. So the committee drafted 2 letters, and ultimately they couldn't pick between the 2 of them. So they sent both letters with committee member George Miller, who hand-delivered the letters to Joseph in Nauvoo on March 10th. For folks interested in the physical documents themselves, the letters have A and B designations, which were determined by the way that the letters were folded together. And the outside of the second letter has the docket for both letters. That's how we figured out which one was first. These letters and accompanying annotations were printed in the Administration Records volume, which presents the Council in 50 minutes, so I won't spend much more time on them today. But they're an important piece of correspondence that Joseph received in 1844. He quickly assembled members of the Temple Committee, members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and other church leaders to discuss the letters the very day he received them. The group met again the next day, giving us March 11th as the founding date of what would become known as the Council of 50. Besides the copy of meeting minutes kept by William Clayton, very few documents from the Council of 50 are extant. However, this volume does contain 2 letters written by a man named Almon Babbitt, who wrote to Joseph in the Council of 50 on 2 occasions to let them know of his intended absence at upcoming council meetings, of which he was expected to attend 100%. One of the outcomes of the Council of 50 was a memorial or a petition to both houses of Congress and to the President of the United States requesting that Joseph Smith be made a member of the U.S. Army and given command of 100,000 armed volunteers to protect westward migrating settlers. The council assigned Council member Orson Hyde to deliver these petitions in person in Washington, D.C., and after he arrived in D.C., Hyde met with members of the Illinois delegation and sent a total of 5 letters back to the council, 3 of which are in this volume. In one of the letters, Hyde explained his decision to eliminate a portion of the memorial that asked that Joseph be appointed as a member of the U.S. Army after receiving feedback from Illinois Senator James Semple that it was likely unconstitutional for the government to do that. This news was not pleasing to the council or Joseph Smith, who said that the whole memorial should be accepted or not at all, and they sent a chastening response back to Hyde. A man named Joel Hamilton Walker, who had connections in Illinois but was living in Boston at the time, heard about this ambitious memorial and wrote a letter to Joseph Smith offering his services in support. He detailed his mercantile and military experience to explain why he would be a great candidate for the job, so to speak. This letter highlights the aspect of Joseph Smith that was not related to his role as a prophet or church leader necessarily, but as an American who had put his ideas out there regarding political and national issues. That did not earn him the nation's respect as a whole, of course, but it did catch people's interest. Other interesting bits of correspondence include a letter from Roloff Wyckoff, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but of New York City, who wrote a letter to Joseph asking for more information about Nauvoo and its economic prospects for him and his family. He asked predictable questions about the cost of housing and transportation, but he also asked about whether households should plan to bring their own bed frames, chairs, and carpeting, hinting that to him, Nauvoo felt far away and remote. What kind of place was it? Joseph had previously received other letters like this, and they can be found in other volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers. And similarly, a response was written by Willard Richards rather than Joseph himself, but a response was sent. The last inquiry I'll highlight tonight is a letter from a man named Washington Tucker in El Dorado, Arkansas. Tucker met a Latter-day Saint missionary while visiting Mississippi the previous winter and became intrigued with Latter-day Saint doctrine. He asked Joseph Smith to send a minister to the people in his community who could, quote, lead us more fully into the light of this wonderful and newly revealed religion and direct us into the true road to salvation, close quote. He wrote to Joseph Smith that this subject consumed all of his waking thoughts, and he dreamt of, quote, nothing else while asleep. Joseph did send Tucker a warm letter in response that was written on the 12th of June, 1844, and that falls outside of our volume's timeline. However, one line from that letter is illuminating and worth mentioning here. Thanking Tucker for his letter, Joseph wrote, quote, a multiplicity of business keeps me from writing as freely to correspondence as I could wish. Still, my heart is large enough for all men, and my sensibilities keen enough to have compassion for every case when justice, mercy, virtue, or humanity requires it. The variety of letters Joseph Smith received in 1844 truly speaks to the diverse interests and aspects of the prophet's life. In many cases, no record of a response from Joseph Smith can be found, though we know that he would have liked to respond to the many letters that he received. As historians who have been privileged to work on the Joseph Smith Papers, we are thrilled that these documents and accompanying research footnotes and source references are available for scholars to use. Thank you.
No. Sorry. Just having too much fun today. I'm just going to hold the thing because I don't got anything to put on to. So, all right. I was thinking, what should I talk to y'all about tonight? What would be a little off the beaten path? And then it came to me, steamboats. Oh yeah, I can see the look in your eyes. You're saying, this is a steamboat talk. It is. It's about the Maid of Iowa, okay, which happens to be my favorite steamboat. It never blew up like a lot of them did. But let me tell you a little bit about some of the circumstances around the Maid of Iowa. They give you an idea, a little bit about Joseph, and also about some of the people that believed in Joseph as a prophet. Okay, so let's give you the background first. So in June of 1843, Joseph ends up purchasing half the interest in the Maid of Iowa. The other half is owned by Dan Jones, who's also the captain of the boat. And Joseph does this because Jones' partner is complaining to him. He says, Joseph, I'm losing all this money. Jones has joined your church, and nobody wants to ship with us or something like that. Something along those lines. And so Jones says that this touched the quick fibers of a noble and generous soul, meaning Joseph. And he says this, he says, when I returned to Nauvoo, Joseph came on board and informed me that the unkind conduct of Mr. Moffat, that's Jones's partner, had won me his friendship, and that he had concluded to buy Mr. Moffat's interest in the boat if I would take him for a partner. So I think this says something about Joseph, that he sees this guy who's in trouble financially. He's getting complained at by his partner for joining the church, new convert, and Joseph helps him out. I think it says something about Joseph's big heart, that he wants to help this guy out. And this isn't the most profitable investment Joseph makes. If you've ever dealt with the Maid of Iowa, it is a debt-ridden steamboat that is not profitable. If I were to describe it, it's one of Joseph's little headaches that he has to deal with. Okay, so like I said, they end up going in the Maid of Iowa. It's not profitable. They're trying to run on the Illinois River. It's not working well. And this guy approaches Dan Jones, and he says, "Hey, why don't you bring the boat down to Louisiana? All right, bring it down to Louisiana, and we can make some money with this boat." And so Jones agrees to do that. He takes the Maid of Iowa, down to Louisiana, and when he gets there, all the jobs are already taken. So he says, "Rats! Now what do I do?" Well, obvious thing is to take the boat up the Red River, which is actually a really bad idea. The Red River, you might, I don't know if y'all are from Texas like I am, but the Red River is the boundary between Texas and Oklahoma, all right? And it's called the Red River because there's all this sediment that goes, it looks red, okay? And there's also lots of trees that fall into this river. And it forms a giant log jam called the raft, okay? So they take the Maid of Iowa up the Red River, and the thing gets all banged up, going through, they have to go through all these little side channels, and this is why they want the Maid of Iowa to do it, because it's a small steamboat, and it can get through all these little channels, but it comes back to New Orleans, and the ship is messed up. It's a hot mess, as we'd say in Southern parlance, and it's again in debt. And word comes from St. Louis. Well, let me back up. So Joseph, while this is going on, this is in, October, November, December, that time frame, we don't know the exact date, that they're going along the Red River. Meanwhile, Joseph's back in Nauvoo, and he leases out his half of the boat to a guy named David Hollister. And so Hollister heads south in December to find the Maid of Iowa. And he and Jones, they meet up in New Orleans after this disastrous trip on the Red River, which has left the boat in bad shape and debt-ridden, and they argue about who controls the boat. And these are the two letters you'll find in D14. The document's volume 14. Sorry, I'm doing my JSP jargon, but y'all are insiders, so it's okay. So, but the thing is, we have these two letters. But what you're not going to get in D14 is the end of the story. And since y'all came, you're going to get it from me. So hold on. It's getting good. All right, so they argue about the steamboat. It's all messed up. And this guy who had persuaded Jones to bring the boat down, he buys Jones's half of the ship. His name's O.A. Miller. And you can look in the New Orleans newspaper, and you'll find advertisements for the Maid of Iowa and owned by O.A. Miller, right? Anyways, so they decide to run the Maid of Iowa in these bayous in Louisiana. They're running them in these bayous, moving sugar and molasses from the plantations around there. And that's how they're trying to make money, and they're stuck there. They can't get out of New Orleans. Now this changes. Recall that Jessica mentioned the ship the Fanny, and the Fanny is what saves their rear end. Got the joke? Anyways, I'm having too much fun up here. But the Fanny comes in and it brings this boatload of English immigrants with it, okay? And they pay passage on the boat, which helps, but the one that really helps is there's a lady on the boat named Mary Bennett, okay? And she had been divorced from her husband in England, and he had paid her a hefty sum of money in this divorce. And she comes on the boat, and, like I said, the boat's not in great shape, and she lays out over $1,000 to help the boat, help fit it out, help repair it, etc. Those are the things the boat needs. So Mary Bennett is important to that story. Now, moving along here, they end up coming from New Orleans up the river, right, to get to Nauvoo, up the Mississippi River. Now, this is problematic for a few things, okay? And this tells us something about the side of being an English immigrant trying to get to Nauvoo. First of all, the river is very swollen. It's an extremely slow, tedious passage. You're talking 5 weeks on a not very big steamboat, okay? And it gets worse because everyone's been drinking river water and they all have diarrhea, okay? It's getting better, right? And it gets even better because every time they stop, people are harassing them. They jump on board the ship and they call them all sorts of names, Joe's rats. They throw stones at the ship. They cut. So at one time the ship is docked and its engine is turned off during a storm, and they go and they cut the rope and set the ship adrift, okay, in the middle of the storm, okay, and they barely survived that one. So you get all these different incidents that why this is not a very pleasant boat ride for a lot of these people. And now we get to them getting to Nauvoo finally. They were trying to make it there for the April conference. They don't make it in time. But on the 13th of April, they finally get into Nauvoo. And I'm just going to read you 3 short accounts of their meeting with Joseph Smith. The first is from Priscilla Mogridge. She had joined the church in England and comes over by herself. None of the rest of her family comes with her. She's young, I think maybe 20 or so. Okay, just to give you an idea of who we're talking about. Now, the ship is so slow that all the saints know it's coming because faster steamboats are passing it, and they're passing on word in Nauvoo. Okay, the Maid of Iowa, it's on its way, Everyone knows this ship is coming. When it finally comes in, everyone's out there. And this is what she says. She says, "So on the day of our arrival, the saints were out en masse to welcome us. I had never before seen any of those assembled, yet I felt certain, as the boat drew near, that I should be able to pick out the prophet Joseph at first sight. This belief I communicated to Mrs. Bennett, again, that's the lady who had saved the boat, whose acquaintance I had made on the voyage. She wondered at it, but I felt impressed by the Spirit that I should know him. As we neared the pier, the prophet was standing among the crowd. At the moment, however, I recognized him according to the impression, and pointed him out to Mrs. Bennett, with whom I was standing alone on the hurricane deck, which is the top deck of the boat. Scarcely had the boat touched the pier when, singularly enough, Joseph sprang on board, and without speaking with anyone, made his way direct to where we were standing, and addressing Mrs. Bennett by name, thanked her kindly for lifting the embargo from the boat, and blessed her for so materially aiding the saints." So that's a really fun story that tells you, I think, something about Priscilla's expectations and wanting to meet the prophet and having that spiritual experience, and also something about Joseph, that he makes a beeline for this lady who had saved his boat. Another one, this is from Thomas Steed. He says, "The prophet Joseph was at the pier. At first glance I could tell it was him by his noble expression. He came on board to shake hands and welcome us by encouraging words and express his thankfulness that we had arrived in safety." One more from William Adams. He says, "I was very happy to behold the prophet and patriarch and have an introduction to them and hear their voice and shake their hands." So a happy ending to a harrowing journey for these people coming all the way from Liverpool. Now what ends up happening here? All right, the boat ends up coming home, heavily in debt. Clayton says that it was $1,700 in debt. Okay, so this is not exactly a prime investment, like I said. And Joseph ends up settling with Dan Jones, and he takes all of the debt from the boat, and he gives Dan Jones property in the city worth over $1,200. So basically, all the bad stuff from the boat Joseph takes for himself. Okay, I think that, again, that tells you about something about Joseph, of how he deals with his friend here. So in the end, what can we learn about Joseph and the saints from this little experience? One is that Joseph has a tendency to want to help people. Right? He helps Dan Jones out buying the ship. He helps him at the end taking on all this debt. And it gives you an idea of some of the grief Joseph has to deal with. Some of the things we don't tend to think about. This is not, again, a profitable business. And he ends up having to take on full responsibility for the poor maid of Iowa. I think it also shows us the place that Joseph held in the heart of these English immigrants who had never seen him before. All right, here's Joseph at the pier, and he's greeting us. He's shaking our hand. I knew by the Spirit that was going to be him. I could tell it was him by his noble countenance. I think this means a lot. And again, these are accounts written a long time after the fact, and they remember this interaction with Joseph. And I think that says something. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Spencer McBride, born and raised in California, to parents who believed it was very important to teach us etiquette, to the extent that when my siblings and I, each one of us got married, we could expect that one of our wedding gifts would be one of those huge volumes of Emily Post's Guide on Etiquette. So I was taught very early that in polite company, there's two topics above all else that you should avoid discussing. And they are religion and politics. God help the man or woman who combines them both. So I stand before you today as one whose career is entirely unfit for polite company. I appreciate you being here anyway. I had the privilege and opportunity in Documents Volume 14 to research and annotate and write introductions for many of the documents that relate to Joseph Smith and the American political system. In particular, his unlikely candidacy for President of the United States. He wasn't going to win. Short of divine intervention, Joseph Smith was not going to be the President of the United States, but that's not why he ran. And this volume, Documents Volume 14, has the vast majority of Joseph Smith documents associated with the presidential campaign, So if that's not enough reason to buy 2 or 3 copies, I don't know what is. And I think at the heart of this, though, is Joseph Smith's political pamphlet, General Smith's views on the powers and policy of the government of the United States. Joseph Smith entered the presidential campaign for one reason, one issue, and that was constitutional reform for the federal government to be empowered to come to the aid and to provide redress and reparations to religious minority groups when states failed to do so. But Joseph Smith was not a one-issue candidate. And this robust political pamphlet, featured in Documents Volume 14, lays out a series of planks in his platform that were at once relevant to the national political scene and relevant to his personal history and that of his family, calling for prison reform, calling for reform of the criminal justice system as a whole, calling for territorial expansion, calling for the end of slavery. You can read this entire pamphlet, which has been available for many, many, many years. What I hope is of added value in Documents Volume 14 is that we painstakingly footnote the document so you can understand exactly where these political views fit in the larger political culture of 1844, how they speak to Joseph Smith's history, and how they speak to the national political conversation going on at that time. But as I think about Joseph Smith's career in politics, this wasn't new. This wasn't his first foray into politics. He wasn't a natural politician. But the very first volume I worked on in the Joseph Smith papers was Documents Volume 7, which covers 1839 until January 1841. And featured in this volume was Joseph Smith's trip to Washington, D.C. And I marvel as I look back to see how he's transformed from kind of a naive supplicant to the President of the United States in Congress in 1839 and 1840, thinking, if I just tell them what happened in Missouri, they're going to understand the justness of our cause and come and help us. And Joseph Smith, in that early date, kind of had his political idealism shattered. He realized he came and made a case based on the ideal to men who only wanted to play political hardball. The Joseph Smith we get in 1844 has grown and developed as a politician. He understands that it's not just enough to make your political case on rational terms. You have to be prepared to play political hardball. Now, I wouldn't say he was the most astute politician even in 1844, but if you see where he had started with his engagement with the federal political system and where he was in 1844, you see this development of his political acumen, his awareness and sensitivity to the political landscape on which he was seeking help and reform. And so there's a lot in Documents Volume 14 to be excited about. If you're one who, like me, gets excited about politics and religion and the mixing of the two, despite what Emily Post has told us not to do, I think there's a lot that you'll enjoy in this volume. And that's where I'll leave off and hand it off to our lead historian, Alex Smith.
I was clapping for what you said, not because you introduced me and said I. Anyway, it's really good to be with you tonight. Honestly, I hope you'll forgive it for just the next few minutes before we turn some time over for some questions and answers. I hope you'll forgive me for taking just a minute to do a little personal reflecting and musing. Like I think probably all of us, I never really believed this would end, the Joseph Smith papers, and it's not over yet. I mean, it will. We do have one more book coming out on, theoretically, the 27th of June. Then again, Chris emailed us and about 3 weeks ago saying, I've got the book in hand. I called him a liar in my response email and said, you must mean 13. 14 isn't due out until the 17th of April. But no, for some reason it came out like a month early. Anyway, Theoretically, the last volume will come out on the 27th of June. But we are nearing the end, and that's a little bit surreal. I don't know how many times over the last 21 years I've been with this project I thought that it would go on ad infinitum, but it really isn't. It really is wrapping up. Of course, there will be online components that will continue for some time, publications of important legal, financial papers and other things. But since we are winding down, I want to do two things in just a minute or two. One is to warn you of what you will read if you happen to open up Documents Volume 14, because there's a warning needed. And the other is just to kind of share a moment or two of personal observation. From day one of this project, we have understood and made it clear internally. This is going to be kind of a behind-the-scenes look. We have understood that our target audience is academic repositories, professional scholars, and that's really the primary audience. That has shaped decisions that we have made every step of the way in terms of how the text itself is presented, what kinds of things we annotate in footnotes and introductions. It's really been the guiding philosophy of the project itself. However, the 400-odd academic libraries throughout the United States that buy every volume that comes out, and the handful of stalwart and kind of silly historians who purchase every volume that comes out have obviously not ended up being the main consumer of the Joseph Smith papers. And this is really heartwarming and comforting to me that members and non-members of the church along the Wasatch Front and elsewhere have been so interested in the product that we're trying to put out, that by far the greatest users of these volumes have become you and me and your neighbors and your fellow ward members and friends. And I think a true testament to how much the history of this area of our people mean to us. But what that's also done is resulted in a little shift of promotional activities, of marketing and that kind of thing, to the point where every time we have a new book released or something come out, we're asked questions like Glenn Rawson's History of the Saints TV series, or newspaper articles that Trent Toon does for Deseret News or something. We're asked questions. What will people find in this latest volume that is uplifting? What new will they learn about Joseph Smith that is that's insightful and that gives them a greater appreciation for the prophet? What kinds of things can help us understand our past with more context? And those are interesting questions, and usually we have ready answers. But here's the warning. You've probably noticed, if you're here at all, and if you've been buying these books and reading them, that the chronological scope of each has been getting shorter. This is a natural byproduct of people in Nauvoo recognizing that important things were happening and keeping more and more records. So this is not our fault. This is all those lunatics back in Nauvoo who started writing more and more about Joseph Smith, and it's on them, not on us. But what it means is that where we did have only a handful of volumes ago in this series, books that covered 2-3 years of content, we're now down to, look, Documents Volume 14 is beginning of January 1844 through mid-May. We're 4.5 months. Spoiler alert, the next volume is 6 weeks. It covers just the final 6 weeks of Joseph Smith's life, and it's nothing but some legal documents. So good luck working your way through that one. I kid, there's great stuff in there. Buy it from Chris. Anyway, sorry, enough of that. But what it also means is that we're nearing the end of a story that we all know how it ends. As we work into the heavy, weighty months of January, February, March, April, beginning of May 1844, there are important and neat and growing, developing themes. we have expansion of important doctrines that Joseph is teaching. We have creation of the Council of 50. We have Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. A lot of growth and development things that are happening. So if you want to talk about themes, there are important highlights that you can look at. But I don't think any of them really compare, as you sit down and read front to back in this book, to an underlying current that runs throughout this. And it's the ultimate declension narrative. We are approaching the end of Joseph's life, and you can tell that things are falling apart, despite what Joseph and his colleagues are trying to accomplish in Nauvoo. The writing is on the wall. You can see that in even the most mundane correspondence that is coming in and going out from Joseph's office. And it's a little hard to deal with. It's even as we were sending this volume up for review to our executives across the street and in our own department, questions were being asked, like what are the important moral takeaways? What can we learn from these months? And there are important messages, and there are neat examples of leadership, of devotion, of community building. But there's also this inevitable theme. That's a word we hate to use in the historical profession. I shouldn't go there. But there is this theme of just things falling apart, of relationships that with people that Joseph was close to for years that are being broken beyond repair, and of challenges and criticism from outsiders, resurfacing of old nemesis like Thomas Sharp, who retakes control of the Warsaw newspaper from the much more moderate Thomas Gregg, and all of a sudden starts launching into just really vitriolic attacks week after week. And so you see it. I'll give just one or two real quick examples. On the 7th of February, we have a very benign, very positive, happy little letter from a relatively new convert of the church living in Quincy, Illinois, a couple days' journey down the Mississippi from Nauvoo, named Joseph Haywood. And he writes to Joseph Smith saying, "Hey, please come down to Quincy and visit us. We would love to have you come speak on a Sunday. It's been a while. The saints here in this congregation would like to hear from you." Joseph responds on the 13th, only a few days after receiving the letter, and says that nothing would delight him more than to go down and meet with the saints in Quincy. And bear in mind, this is February. We're still months out from his assassination. He says, but he thinks that it would be unwise and imprudent for him to travel just the day and a half down to Quincy to meet with the saints, because there are enough places between here and there where his safety would be a concern, where he was worried that some efforts would be made to extradite him once again to Missouri, or simply take him entirely illegally, that his life would be in danger. And that kind of thing, where you have a religious leader trying to communicate directly with a member of their flock only a very short distance away, and yet feeling limited in his capacity to actually administer in the functions and roles that he has. And so even in a situation like this, where we would normally just have a quick positive exchange of a church member, Joseph, saying, yep, be right there, and yet in the back of his mind, even somewhere like this, you see Joseph's fears, looming concerns, growing hesitation about what's going on in the county. And it's probably no surprise. In preparing for some of these marketing events that we've got this week and next, I was kind of surveying once again. It's been a while since we actually stopped working on this book. Obviously been with copy editors, types editors, press, and things like that. So trying to get a little refresher, I did a little survey of the 99 documents in this volume, and you can hardly go 1 week during this 4.5 month period where you don't run into one document or another that, whether explicitly or implicitly, has really strong tones of tension, of conflict. And that is the story you'll read when you read this volume. It's honestly tragic in a way, but it doesn't mean that it isn't uplifting or inspiring or insightful, that there are things in it that we can learn from, but it's, you can see what's happening. I don't know if you want to call it a decrescendo of what's of Nauvoo life, or if you want to call it a crescendo of animosity. Whatever musical motif you want to use, something's going on here, and you can read the writing on the wall. It has been, I hope I can speak for my friends here. It's kind of sobering to work on this book for a few years, and with every footnote that you write, every introduction that you craft, seeing some of what's coming. Anyway, very much appreciate your interest and concern. Like I say, this book is obviously for you more than anyone else. And I'll close with that. Thank you.
I don't know if you guys want to stand up there and then let people ask questions all together.
Jessica would love to moderate.
Questions on the book?
Are we going to stand up or
Whatever you like.
Yeah, we'll stand up. I'll stand up.
You talked about some of the friendships breaking down. William Law, I suspect, is one. I guess maybe two-part question. Is there any new materials about William Law? And then number two, his journal was published a long time ago, but had minimal information about the journal. Do you have any insight on, do we know more about the journal? Have you done some research to kind of back that up? I don't know who. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, and you may want to, Chris will tell you to repeat the question.
So the first question was kind of about, in particular, William Law and his journal and its provenance, and I guess the quick answer would be we haven't done a lot of additional work on that. We had some real debate, friendly debate about its use with Journals Volume 3, because obviously anytime I don't want to put William Law's journal in the same camp as John C. Bennett's expose of the same, but they're very different records and have very different issues. But anytime you have something that's very clearly one-sided, one perspective, you've got to ask questions, and particularly in a case like this where the provenance of the William Law Journal just is so problematic. That said, we did use it. We arrived at the decision with Journals Volume 3, and Brent could talk about this too if he's still here. Anyway, we arrived at the decision that we had to use it, that it provided a perspective that was simply not present in any of our other records, and important information. And so we continued that procedure here, but I don't honestly remember if we revisited the actual philosophical discussion about that. And to answer your question about whether we've learned anything new about that, no. But email Robin Jensen. He was in more recent contact with Lyndon Cook about it than anyone I know. But yeah, anyway, it's we do need to use records like that. Your question about whether we see a lot new about law in this volume, no, not really. Where we do have maybe some new stuff is with Francis Higbee, a little bit. One of the very earliest documents in the volume is a long letter from Francis to Joseph, just really upset about how he's been treated in a recent Nauvoo City Council meeting that, of course, kind of sets off all of his litigious activities for the next few months. Anyway.
So I have a question about your editorial process. and what you decide to include and not include and annotate and not, and things like that. And maybe this might be more for the two of you, since I think you maybe have been longer with the project. One of the amazing things about the project is its openness and its transparency about all sorts of topics. When you go to the church library, church history library, and look at some of the original documents, later documents, sometimes they'll be redacted. And the redactions sometimes are temple related, or second anointing related, or sexual material, things like that. But that's not in. There's nothing in the printed materials that I think has been redacted. So you do talk about temple stuff and second anointings and sexual material. The Lyman Littlefield letter is kind of interesting to read that way. Can you talk about how you're able to do that?
Go for it.
So, yeah, the goal of the project, repeating the question is our editorial process, the transparency, how we decide what to include. The goal is to publish everything. Every surviving Joseph Smith document that is a verified Joseph Smith document, which means sometimes we publish as an appendix certain documents that there's some question about. We still want it out there if there's uncertainty. We have a level of trust with the ecclesiastical leadership of the church, that as those that know the history of writing Latter-day Saint history hasn't always been there, but is there now. And there's a commitment to publish everything. And sometimes that means some of the things we publish are hard. It's not what some of our ecclesiastical leaders are used to reading, but there's that commitment to transparency and openness that is the guiding principle of what we're doing. Now, what gets into a book is also, I think, an aspect of this, because what you get is, we are comprehensive on the website. But if Joseph Smith is invited, and the papers of John Adams does something similar. John Adams, as President of the United States, was invited to every single social event in the city of Washington, D.C. If the Adams papers published every single invitation he received, you would have 20 volumes of nothing but redundant invitations, right? So we publish in print every letter Joseph Smith wrote, every letter written to him, discourses, kind of this group that we informally call core documents. And then when there's business documents or legal documents, we publish in the volume a representative sample and all the remaining documents of that variety of that genre on the website. And so one thing you might notice in print with the documents that we publish, and some of them might strike us as more sensitive, the type that in a previous era or with a different project might have redactions in it. We add footnotes. And again, one thing we do well as a Joseph Smith Papers project, or maybe do too much of depending on your view, is we add footnotes. And sometimes the footnotes, though, serve a purpose of helping to contextualize something, perhaps more than we would typically do under different circumstances. And I think it goes to what Alex explained. We are doing this project primarily with a scholarly audience in mind, but we are aware that a lot of people who are not professionally trained scholars have interest in this product, interest in this series, including people who have varying states of relationships with the different churches that trace their history to Joseph Smith. And so we do try in many cases to provide footnotes in those instances that help those who are not from that professional scholarly background, who are encountering some of this information, be able to contextualize it better. And I think that's one area where we're very aware of who our intended audience is, but we're also aware of the larger audience that uses our books. Alex, you want to add anything to that?
Well, not really. Just to, no, thanks. No, just to say that we, the document editor's continual lifelong bugaboo is to try to avoid saying what you know. It all comes back to responsibility. What does the text actually demand so that readers can understand what's written there? And oftentimes, You know, a lot of the documents are pretty discreet in how they themselves address some of these issues. Temple ritual information, plural marriages, things like that are often given in pretty oblique references. And so we do, we say what we think needs to be said, but whether it's about something sensitive / sensational or even something mundane and typical, our constant internal battle is to kind of cull that back to what is needed rather than what we would really love to talk about. But anyway.
Good question, Gary. Any follow-up?
So is it safe to say then that early on in the project, at the beginning, you already addressed these kinds of questions and worked through stuff, and that's all been taken care of, and then you can just, you know, with those guidelines, I guess, you can do pretty much what you think needs to be done?
Which doesn't, I think yes, but which doesn't necessarily mean that from day one we had a real grasp of what all there would be. I mean, of course, Dean Jesse's work had laid a huge groundwork, and Christy Best and others, but that doesn't mean that we automatically, that we were really had on our, and of course in the last 20 years, new documents have come to light. New is the wrong word. We didn't work with Mark Hoffman at all. But yeah, new things surfacing and stuff like that. But anyway, so yeah, I don't, things have come up that have challenged the questions along the way, and we've had wrestles with internally and with reviewers about what needed to be treated. We have a real quick anecdotal thing. We had very on with Journals Volume 2, we had a situation where Willard Richards, as a physician by trade and with his interest in medicine, had recorded in Joseph Smith's journal 43 pages of graphic detail about a medical malpractice suit that Joseph presided over as judge. And when you open up Joseph Smith's journal, you're really not expecting to read 40 pages of detail about a pregnancy that went wrong. I mean, that shouldn't. And so we actually had early reviewers that, well, we had one, I won't name names, it wouldn't matter now anyway, who paper clipped that section of his copy of the journal together and sent a note, this isn't needed, no one needs to read this in Joseph Smith's journal. And our default response, and I think a pretty easy one at that point, was to say, that's not our call, it's there, and so we're going to publish it. And yeah, if you want good bedtime reading, go read Journals 2 tonight. Anyway.
Right here.
Thanks, Spencer. I see this, you know, I came out from California for this tonight because I see this as a time to really celebrate what you and your colleagues have done. And so in reflecting on this project, are there any volumes that you would say are your favorite or that stand out? I know mine, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Each of you.
Yeah, that's an easy question.
Well, I should have sat next to Gary and I would have thought of a better one.
No. That's a good question. You know, and this is the thing about Joseph Smith, is for people that come to Joseph Smith, there's as a focus of historical study, there's usually some basic fundamental elements that attract them to this study. Sometimes it's a personal faith or connection to a faith that traces its history back to Joseph Smith. I'd say often that's the case. But it's amazing to see how our volumes have been used. I have a friend, she studies the history of essentially grooming in American society, how you wear your hair, so on and so forth. And when she discovered the story of Porter Rockwell entering the Christmas party at the Mansion House, long hair, unkempt, being treated like a Missourian, and wrestled to the ground, and all the conclusions that the saints jumped to based on the grooming of this individual, all of a sudden we have this history of hair in the early American Republic that cites the Joseph Smith papers. And it's amazing how the Latter-day Saints were just they were products of their time in so many ways that whatever you study, there's a good chance you can find something about it in the Joseph Smith papers. For me, I treasure the aspects of many volumes that talk about Joseph Smith's kind of legal and political thinking. And some of that's just my own preference in my own scholarship. But I think there's something to be said about proximity to power. What do people think happens in Washington, D.C. versus what actually happens there? And there seems to be a disconnect. The farther removed you are at this time geographically, the more idealistic your view of politics in the nation's capital could be. And we kind of see Joseph Smith's development of his political acumen and awareness over the course of several volumes. But I'd say it really gets going in earnest from volume 7 through volume 15. So that's where I would go. We'll go this side.
So I was brought on to help wrap up D12 and then work on this documents volume 14, and so I don't have a large selection to work from. So just because I spent the most time in this volume, it would probably have to be my favorite. And I guess kind of on a personal note, we were working on drafting this when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we worked on this through, working from home, and just there's a lot of that went into it personally, just because of what was going on with life and in the world as we worked on this project. And so it'll just always represent kind of perseverance to me in working through something, not even in maybe the best of circumstances, but still doing really high quality work and maintaining connections through colleagues. Like we used to just talk back and forth between our offices, but we were kind of distant from each other for a while, but we still brought it all together. So because of a lot of those factors, it just represents a lot to me in a sort of baptism by fire in documentary editing, and the context of Nauvoo. I really got to know 1844 pretty well, and so I appreciated that experience.
Yeah, I was a little late to the game too. I joined the same year that Jessica did, and so I worked on documents 14 and 15, so all I know is 1844. If something happened outside that year, good luck, folks. You'll have to tell me about it. But I think, and I was working on them essentially simultaneously for most of the time. And so a lot of ways they sort of mix together. They're the same time, same kind of story going on. But each one is a little bit different flavor. I think D14 is more, there's more of the mundane in it, like I'm working on a land deed or stuff like that, as opposed to D15 feels like crisis, if that makes sense. There's that sense of the martyrdom is happening, all the different things from the destruction of the expositor. So each one, I guess, holds a different place in my heart for those sort of reasons. And it's been a blessing to work on both of them. But again, I need to get out of 44. Help me.
I'm kind of astonished that there's such consistency from volume to volume. It's really kind of staggering to me. I really hate to point to a book that I did not serve as a volume editor on, but Joe, I'll go with Journals Volume 1, just as kind of a favorite in one way. I think it was so different than what every other documentary edition was doing at the time. We met regularly with colleagues and associates from other papers projects, Thomas Jefferson papers, Adams Family papers, Martin Luther King Jr. papers, and to try to come up with images of what our product should look like. And when you look at the resources over the years that the Miller family and ultimately the church have ended up putting into the project, I think it's just kind of astounding. But Journals 1 was the real, being the first volume of all of the series, was really the one that serves as not only a model for our now kind of trademark style, look, feel, but it was also the biggest divergence from what everyone else in the community was really doing at the time. And I think so for that reason, I think it stands as kind of a testament to the value that that church leadership places in the papers of our founding prophet. That Mormons are viewed as record-keeping people, and there's a reason for that. It starts with Joseph, and if we did a comprehensive Brigham project, well, that would be a hoot, but that would be like, it would also be dangerous, and it would be long. Anyway, so, but I think it's neat that that this has been done for Joseph. Anyway.
Well, I just want to thank you, because the love that you've shown for these documents, it shows through. Not only does it show through in these beautiful books that have been published, but events like this where you speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just curious, now that the project's being wrapped up, what are your plans? What projects are you going on to next?
Yeah, so in the church history department, there's been two very large research and writing projects going on for a very long time. The Joseph Smith papers and the 4-volume history called Saints. And both very exciting projects, but they take a lot of bandwidth, especially in terms of resources, people and otherwise. What you'll see from the church history department in coming years are a lot more publication projects in number, but also a greater variety in focus and subject, a lot more global history. We've been doing a lot of women's history in the last decade or so. Expect that to continue and to expand, and a lot more variety. One of the great things, and it's hard to say this without sounding boastful, so please hear it in the spirit I intend it. One of the things that having a project like the Joseph Smith papers for so long has done is it has allowed the church history department to hire dozens of PhD historians with deep research experience on certain topics. In fact, you look at the size of the average history department at most colleges and universities in the United States, and the church history department outnumbers them in the number of PhD historians it employs. Now, we're different in that we all study essentially one topic, but we have this staff that has the skills, has the training, has the interest, and there's so much more of the church's history to tell and to share and to publicize. I think you can look forward to seeing a lot more projects in number and a lot greater variety in the subject and focus.
So you're all going to remain employees of the church and doing history?
I don't want to speak for everyone else, or anyone else wants to add to that.
No, and there's funding for all you to keep going, right?
Yes.
So on the available on the Church Historians Press website right now, there are over 1,000 discourses given by Eliza R. Snow. We made a selection of those, and we're going to be annotating them and introducing them. Not quite to the same degree as the Joseph Smith papers, just because the demands and editorial styles are different. But that's a really fun project that I'm working on right now. So I've gotten to know Eliza R. Snow pretty well as we've worked on that. So and also making more. In some ways, we'll all be involved in making more sources available online through the Church Historians Press website, and more journals and papers, and so that there's publishing, but also making sources available, and that'll always be something that we balance. Right here?
Yeah, mine's a two-part question with reference to what you said a moment ago. Okay. What was so different about Journals Volume 1 than others were doing in the other papers project? And then kind of going with that, I'm wondering about the difference between the amount and quality of material available for the Prophet Joseph versus other religious founders of similar era.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because there are other good editions. Jonathan Edwards' papers are a good comparison. in terms of quality of annotation, we're simply leagues better than any. I'm kidding. No, but in terms of quantity, Joseph Smith Papers is on the heavier side, certainly, than most editions. We have been criticized. Do we have any management people here beside you, Spencer? But anyway, we've been criticized over the years for devoting maybe a few too many resources to like back matter tools, for instance. If you open up any of our volumes, the last third of the book or so is going to be biographical directories, map packets, aside from the obvious indices. There will be organizational charts, geographical directories in some, Revelation scripture charts, things like that. To the extent that even if you're not talking about just footnotes on every page in the volume, are the contextual apparatus for our volumes is just huge. And so I think it, really way beyond what most documentary editions do. And so that's been it's been a really neat resource to have as we've worked on this, so that we can feel like we can help identify what readers need to know to understand these documents. But it's also a pretty far cry from what we might expect from a lot of what, for instance, even our own Church Historians Press will be able to do in future volumes. There will be a range. Part of it has to do with the audience we're writing to as well. Some call for very different things, and books like Saints are, far more interpretive, but also only really have referential footnotes rather than continuing interpretive expansion. So, I don't know. It's quite different from most doc editions in that sense, but which is debatable whether that's needed. Again, decades ago, we met with a fellow named Dan Feller, who not only famous as an early U.S. historian, but also has since, Robin Jensen and I met with him, has since become the general editor of the Andrew Jackson Papers. And we sat down with him and we handed him examples of some of what we considered our heaviest level of annotations, some just doozies of footnotes that you wouldn't want to work your way through. And we asked for his feedback on whether this was overkill, that kind of thing. And his response is no interest in religious history, really, even in general, let alone Latter-day Saint history, has no affiliation. He said, if I were working on a project publishing the papers of a prophet, I would view the documents I was publishing as warranting a higher level of explanation and exposition than any other kind of important figure in American history. And it was kind of a humbling response, and yeah, we've benefited from it, and we'll see. Anyway.
On the second part of the question is, how does Joseph Smith's documentary record compare to other religious leaders? I'd say of the time, it's on the heavier side. But you compare him to Brigham Young, right? Brigham Young served much longer, lived much longer. We're talking 80,000 plus documents. Joseph Smith is just over 13,000. He died at age 38. But the caveat here is so many of Joseph Smith's surviving documents are not religious in nature. I mean, thousands of land deeds that he signed. We classify each one as a Joseph Smith document, or a promissory note that he signed. And so what's fascinating is, if we're just talking sheer numbers of documents, he's high for that time period. But the amount of his religious teachings, and while we're grateful for every single bit we have, Joseph Smith's speaking style, speaking extemporaneously, meaning he doesn't have these sermon notebooks that other religious figures of the day have. We rely on the notes. As Andy knows all too well from his work, right? And so it's interesting. For religious leaders like Joseph Smith, comparable to Joseph Smith, we have a lot of total documents. But if we look at how many we have that are religious in nature, then I think that comparison comes back to being a little more even, if that makes sense. But not every religious figure of that time was trying to establish cities and take on the role of urban planner and mayor. Yeah, great question.
Can I push you a little bit on your book project, since that's why we're here tonight? Jessica, you talked about Lizar Snow. What else? What other book projects do you know of in the women's history involvement? What else is there coming?
History?
Can you? Yeah.
Am I forgetting anything?
Is the history of the young women? Is that still?
Yeah.
That's part of your.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess. Yeah. So there is a forthcoming publication about the history of the Young Women Organization. That it is forthcoming, but it feels in the very in the rear
It's
view,
back,
just because of where it is in the
Right.
is in the lineup, so to speak. Just because it's in the review stages and it's been completed for a while, but that one is very exciting. Just because a comprehensive history of the Young Women Organization has not been done to that degree, and will just add so much insight into the lives of Latter-day Saint women and young women throughout the 20th century, especially in the areas that were understudied. And so I had the opportunity and great fortune to work as an intern on that project a few years ago before I started on the Joe Smith papers. So I know a little bit about that, but I know that one's going to be completed. And there's still some plans in the works. Like we're kind of figuring out what the direction is going to be, though there will be a commitment, like I said, that's sort of dual purpose of publishing material that will appear in print form, but also just making sources available, like the Diaries of Emmeline B. Wells. That was a big completion. That and Eliza Arsenault discourses and recent
Belle Harris.
Belle Harris. I was going to say it ends in Harris. I was trying to remember her first name. So yeah, be sure to check those out on the Church Historians Press website.
Are any of you involved with the Clayton? Alex, can you talk about that a little bit to everybody?
Sure.
Here,
So
come on camera.
So no, where is the camera? Turn it off. No. Oh no, it really is there. Spencer swap. No. So the Clayton Nauvoo journals will be a single print volume, and I'll try to make this quick. So Clayton's 1840s journals really ought to be looked at as a single journal, I would argue, from his Manchester journal that brought him over to Illinois, and then 3 volumes, and that was published as Manchester Mormons by Jim Allen, Tom Alexander, and then 3 volumes, actual physical manuscript volumes of his Nauvoo journal that the First Presidency has owned and still owns, but are in our archives. And then there were 2 Overland Trails volumes that BYU owns that have also been published. George Smith had included excerpts from the 3 Nauvoo volumes in his Intimate Chronicle, but the total text there, James B. Allen, that did the original biography of William Clayton, Trials of Discipleship, republished No Toil Nor Labor Fear. He calculated, and my numbers are pretty close, that about 21% of the text of those 3 Nauvoo volumes were included in George Smith's book. And so the bulk of what is in those journals has not been published. And so yeah, we're midway through working on that. The draft's going well. We have a team, myself, Jeffrey Mahaz, Robin Jensen, Brendan Metcalf, and some editors. But anyway, we're partway through. We're entering some early review stages for the first half. I don't want to give any sort of official statement about like release date or anything like that, but it's a few years out at least. But it'll be a neat volume. It has a lot of wonderful text in it. It has a lot of challenging stuff in it. It says far more about plural marriage than any other Illinois era record, except maybe John C. Bennett's, but it's in a different way. But anyway, it's from someone who practiced it. It's pretty detailed, and it also has a lot about Joseph and Emma's relationship. It has a lot about MN12 post martyrdom, that kind of thing. A lot of really neat stuff. a lot of what we might consider more sensational elements were included in the excerpts. In fact, I'd say the bulk of them in George Smith's book. So what it remains is a lot of really important social history context that kind of gives us a better understanding of what's already available and out there. Really, really neat stuff. Clayton is involved. He's a creative diarist. He's a detailed diarist. For instance, his journal tells far more about Joseph's daily life for the last couple of years of Joseph's life than Joseph's own journal does. Because Willard Richards kept that, and Clayton's a way better diarist than Willard Richards. So anyway, there are a lot of neat things about this, but the important thing I think about the volume, can we really turn that on? No. The important thing I think to me is that is the trust that it represents. That it is evidence of transparency of church leaders. When the First Presidency gave permission and public approval to publish this in 2017, it was a neat moment because we consider really the last major Joseph Smith era document that is being released by the church. So we had the Book of the Law of the Lord, we had the Council of 50 Minutes, we had the Manuscript Revelation book, and then Clayton's journal is really the last major multi-entry document owned by the First Presidency that will be released. So I think it's a tremendous statement about wanting Latter-day Saints to have access to founding documents.
Thank you so much.
Anna.
Having listened to what you just said, and since this group is very conversant with what you were talking about, William Clayton, and attributing to George Smith, I think I ought to make a public statement about that. On January 5th, 1979, I met with Don Schmidt. I came there with the purpose of double-checking the important August 16th, 1843 entry that I had transcribed. For a couple years I thought, I need to check that back because I had brackets and I had parentheses in that particular entry. And it's an unusual thing to have it happen. And I didn't use sick to say, okay, I want to know what did I make a mistake, what have you. So I went there, he walked down to the vault, pulled the document out, and then he, I looked at it and said, oh, he used parentheses and he used brackets. Okay, that's pretty amazing because it's unusual. And so he then said to me, do you want to know something? And I said, sure, whatever you want to say. Went and shut the door. And he told me, on Monday, the First Presidency will be bringing the William Clayton diaries over to be reviewed. And on the 11th of January, I had those diaries in my hands. And who said no?
Oh, I think it's a separate
Sorry, I
conversation.
think he's on the phone.
You're wrong.
That's a post hoc, ergo propter hoc fallacy. That was a perfect one. That was great. Somebody said, "You're telling falsehood." Right. I've spent these, since this is 79. Okay, so think about, here we are in 23. How long I've lived. They didn't steal all of my entries from the William Clayton diaries, but every one of those ones that are in George Smith and the Tanners and so forth were me. It was my intellectual property. In fact, when I sued the Tanners, I did it for the purpose of the fact that here I am going off for PhD work. I want to be able to say it the way I want it to be said instead of the way they would say it. I don't care how they did it. Then, of course, what they did do was a travesty. But they ruined me getting my PhD when I made my choice that I would take this effort. And it turns out that my lawyer didn't know the copyright law. I didn't know the copyright law. And when it came to the very moment of, okay, the judge says, well, we're throwing out any copyright thing. This doesn't apply. I became an expert about copyright. All 88 pages of that which was stolen was my intellectual property. It still is. The republications of all my entries is actually a violation of my copyright, because the compilation copyright is defensible, and it just wasn't known. But I wanted to be able to make that in case somebody else had the notes that were going to be the foundation, because what I did in my master's thesis was to talk about a generality. But in my dissertation, I was going to talk on the clash of cultures, Joseph Smith and the Western marriage worldview. And what I intended to do there has still not been done in our division. But that's not my priorities for the books I'm working on Joseph now. So in saying this, and a number of jealous people, because I was one of 3 people seeing this in that time. And then when it came to the fact that Jim was going to talk at the John Whitmer Association and present a number of entries out of the diaries, I decided that I would talk to my good friend Richard L. Anderson. I knew that he had asked for it, but he never got permission to see the diaries. And I'm thinking, I'm this punk kid, I don't have any degree, and I'm moving into a history degree at BYU, and I'm thinking, this man is going to do the letters of Joseph and Emma. He's got to see these diaries. And so I went and saw him.
Andy, I'm sorry to cut you off. I know this is a very personal and meaningful experience for you. No, I'm not trying to embarrass you. I just know that we're running out of time.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for everyone being here tonight. Thank you for your comments. I just wanted to say one of the things that my dad loved about this store and this business was the gathering that we had. Tonight, look at here, we have 4 editors of the Joseph Smith papers. We have renowned authors and researchers and publishers here with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you come back again. And thank you again to the editors being here. If you would like to get a book, please come up to the front here and we'll arrange that for you. And the editors will be here for a few more minutes to answer questions if you have. And if you wouldn't mind putting your chairs up against the case next to you there. And thank you for being here. There is food out in the hallway. Thanks again.